On July 1, 1940, the dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco, met with the Portuguese ambassador. Those were dark times. World War II was ravaging Europe, and Nazi troops seemed unbeatable, conquering everything in their path and annihilating their enemies. A week before the meeting between the Spanish leader and the Portuguese diplomat, France had surrendered to the might of the German army, lasting only 6 weeks before raising the white flag. During the meeting, Franco tried to convince the ambassador that Portugal should abandon its traditional alliance with Great Britain. The Generalissimo, a pragmatic ruler, said the following: "Hitler is an extraordinary man, moderate, sensitive, full of humanity, and with great ideas. Germany has already won the war. The most that England can do is to hold out a bit longer, hoping for better peace terms than France." What the dictator was implying, and he was correct, was that Portugal's situation was extremely complex. Its geographical location made it bordered by Nazi Germany and Fascist Spain to the east, and by Allied-occupied Britain to the north. The major players in the war were eager to gain control of Portugal and its natural resources. In such a delicate context, the Portuguese would have to move cautiously if they didn't want to be invaded and lose their independence. However, they would do more than that, directly influencing the outcome of the conflict and the lives of thousands of people. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Portugal's role during World War II. To understand this history, we have to go back to the decade before the outbreak of the war. In 1926, a group of military leaders led a coup against the Portuguese government. This marked the end of the Republic and the beginning of a dictatorship, which initially also failed to address the nation's serious economic problems. The situation could only be rectified thanks to the intervention of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, an economist who took over the Ministry of Finance and quickly stabilized the country. By 1932, the minister had become the strongman of the government, valued both by the Portuguese civilian population and the armed forces, who saw him as a savior. With the support he enjoyed, Salazar assumed the position of prime minister and enacted a new constitution with strong authoritarian characteristics, granting him dictatorial powers. The leader established the Estado Novo, as his single-party regime was called, which was anti-communist and Catholic in nature. Censorship was commonplace, and newspapers, radio, and later television were monitored for criticisms of the government or the church. The cult of the leader was encouraged, and through official propaganda, Salazar was portrayed as an austere, moderate man wholly committed to the well-being of his people. Meanwhile, the streets were patrolled by the dreaded PIDE, the International and State Defense Police, whose task was to suppress opposition and sow terror among the population. Those who dared to defy Salazar could be detained, interrogated, and mercilessly tortured. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hitler had come to power, and Nazism was growing stronger. The Führer's speeches made it clear that he intended to expand into Europe, and it seemed that war was on the horizon. In this context, the Portuguese leader maneuvered to reaffirm his country's neutrality. He did not want the Lusitanian nation to become involved in a conflict he felt was not their own, in which they had more to lose than to gain. On the other hand, he feared that dictator Francisco Franco might lean towards the Axis, given his sympathies for Nazism. If this happened, it was possible that Spain's next step would be to invade and annex Portugal. Therefore, in March 1939, just a few months before the start of the war, Salazar convinced the Spanish government to sign a non-aggression treaty that would keep the Iberian Peninsula neutral. The Nazis had their eyes on Portugal for several reasons. The first was its geographical location, as it could control the Bay of Biscay and the Strait of Gibraltar. If they gained control of these waters, Hitler could expedite his plans to conquer England. At the same time, Portugal was a colonial empire with various overseas territories of strategic value in Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic Ocean. Lastly, Hitler knew that Portugal had significant reserves of tungsten, a mineral essential for the military industry, as it was used to make ammunition. At the start of World War II, Salazar's country had become a coveted treasure for all. Not only did the Germans desire it, but also the Allies, particularly the British, who pressured the Portuguese government to maintain preferential treatment toward them. The Portuguese had to employ the art of diplomacy to please both sides and not appear too favorable to either. It was a delicate and dangerous game. Disrupted in the summer of 1940. As we mentioned at the beginning of this video, by that time, France had surrendered to Germany. Francisco the cities and flatlands to Germany and mobilize his army towards the Alps. This territory was considered a fortress, as the Axis would have found it extremely difficult to use their tanks and air support there. At the same time, this would allow the Swiss soldiers to apply guerrilla tactics, taking advantage of their knowledge of the area. This meant a defense of almost millions of men, well-trained, armed and in a complex terrain for the invaders. Even if the conquest succeeded, the possibility of resistance movements in the Alps would have forced Germany to maintain a good number of troops there. According to many, this is the main reason why Hitler never launched Operation Tannenbaum, since Switzerland did not have such a high strategic value as to justify such resource mobilization. At the same time, as the war progressed, the Axis priorities shifted, especially its struggles against Britain and the Soviet Union. However, other specialists and historians indicate that this was not the real reason behind the non-invasion. If Napoleon had managed to win the Alps and conquer Switzerland, why couldn't Hitler, who at that time was basically unstoppable and had managed to triumph under similar conditions in the Yugoslav Balkans and in Greece? Many authors maintain that Nazi Germany did not attack the Swiss country simply because its neutrality was convenient, and many have even considered it an ally of the Axis. Swiss sociologist and political scientist Jean Ziegler summed up this view categorically: Hitler was crazy, but not crazy enough to attack his own banker. It turns out that during the war, the Third Reich sent and kept a large amount of gold and money in Swiss banks, so attacking this country would have been economically risky. At the same time, German gold panning gave Nazi generals and officers a great deal of insurance in case they lost the war, as they eventually did. In addition, Swiss companies produced weapons for the German forces. Although neutral and independent, the Swiss supplied 10 times more weapons and military technology to the Axis than to the Allies. In the same way, Switzerland was a perfect place for political meetings and conversations between both sides that, although not officially recognized, happen more often than people think. In conclusion, there was no practical use in invading Switzerland, since its neutrality favored Hitler. The Tannenbaum operation could be extremely counterproductive if the conquest became more complex and required more resources. Even if this operation went as the Third Reich had planned, the invasion might still have negative consequences, in political and economic terms, so it was not worth it in any way. Eventually, all plans to invade Switzerland completely fizzled out in 1943, after the fall of Fascist Italy. Currently, the role of the Swiss government in the war continues to be something studied and questioned, largely due to its close relations with Nazism. Although it managed to maintain its independence and neutrality throughout the conflict, things could have been very different and negative for Switzerland if Germany won the war, since an invasion would have come sooner or later, as a well-known song sung by the Wehrmacht. Switzerland is a porcupine that we'll have for dessert, then we'll go for the whole wide world, and bring us Roosevelt. We reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think the war would have changed anything, against or in favor of Hitler, if Germany invaded Switzerland? Leave your answer in the comment box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history. Thank you very much for joining us until the end. And stay tuned for our next video.